Have you ever had a relationship change without a single argument? No dramatic ending, no betrayal, no obvious reason, just a quiet feeling that something between you and another person no longer fits the way it once did. Maybe they stopped reaching out as often. Maybe conversations became strangely tense. Maybe you noticed yourself choosing your words more carefully, unsure why something that once felt so natural now felt unexpectedly fragile. At first, it's easy to assume we've done something wrong. We replay old conversations. We search for the sentence we shouldn't have said, the message we should have answered sooner. Because if we can find the mistake, perhaps we can fix it. Perhaps we can return the relationship to the way it used to be. Welcome to Slow Down with Brenda. If you're here today, I'd like to invite you to consider a different possibility. Not because it's always true, but because when it is true, it can change the way we carry a great deal of unnecessary guilt. What if the relationship didn't become more difficult because you became more difficult? What if it became more difficult because you quietly became healthier? We usually expect healthy growth to improve our relationships. Sometimes it does. But not every relationship is built around the healthiest version of who we are. Some relationships were built around our availability, others around our silence, some around our habit of apologizing before anyone asked us to. None of these patterns are usually discussed out loud. No one sits down and says, "I need you to keep doubting yourself so I can feel comfortable." Life is rarely that obvious. A woman once told me about a friendship that had lasted almost 15 years. She said the moment she stopped calling to apologize for things that weren't her fault, the friendship quietly began to fall apart. Nothing was ever said out loud. The calls just became shorter, then further apart. For months, she kept asking herself what she'd done wrong, until one day she realized nothing had gone wrong at all. She had simply stopped playing a role the friendship had quietly depended on. Every close relationship develops a kind of emotional rhythm. Without realizing it, we learn what version of ourselves keeps things feeling predictable. Who apologizes first? Who gives in? Who always explains? Who carries the emotional weight? These patterns become so familiar we stop noticing them. They simply begin to feel like the relationship itself. Then, life changes us. Not all at once, almost never dramatically. Perhaps therapy helps us name emotions we've spent years avoiding. Perhaps exhaustion teaches us that constantly proving our goodness is a burden we can no longer carry. From the outside, those changes may look almost invisible. You still care, you still listen, you still love. But you no longer apologize for existing. You no longer explain every decision. And strangely, that small internal shift can change the entire emotional balance of a relationship. Not because anyone is trying to create conflict, but because the relationship was quietly organized around patterns that no longer exist. Imagine two people dancing together for years, each knowing the steps without thinking. Then one person gently changes the rhythm, not to hurt the other, simply because they've learned a healthier way to move. The old dance suddenly feels awkward, not because either person is bad at dancing, because they're no longer following the same choreography. Perhaps what we're calling rejection is sometimes just the discomfort that appears when an old emotional pattern no longer works. That doesn't mean the other person is cruel. It doesn't mean you're automatically right. Instead of asking, "Why are they treating me this way?" we might gently ask, "What changed in the emotional rhythm between us?" Which brings us to a deeper question. Why does a healthy change in one person sometimes feel so unsettling to someone else? The answer has less to do with love than most of us imagine, and much more to do with the remarkable way the human mind protects the stories it already knows. One of the brain's quietest jobs is to make tomorrow feel predictable. Not perfect, just familiar. Long before we're aware of it, our minds build small expectations about the people around us. We don't consciously think, "She always apologizes first," or "He'll probably say yes." These become invisible shortcuts. The brain loves shortcuts. They're efficient, and they help us move through life without rethinking every interaction from scratch. If you've driven the same road to work for years, you know this feeling. Sometimes you arrive without remembering each individual turn. Your brain already built the pattern. Relationships work in a surprisingly similar way. We begin predicting one another. Who reaches out after an argument? Who smooths over uncomfortable moments? Eventually, those patterns stop feeling like habits. They begin feeling like certainty. And certainty is comforting, even when it isn't healthy. That's why change can feel so confusing. Not because change is bad, but because it interrupts the map our minds have quietly been relying on. Psychologists describe part of this through confirmation bias. Once we've formed an idea about someone, we naturally notice the moments that support it and overlook the moments that challenge it. Not because we're dishonest, because that's how the mind reduces complexity. I once heard from a listener who ran into a friend she hadn't seen in almost 8 years. The friend had gone through a divorce, moved cities, and started over completely. Quieter now, more grounded. But for the first hour of their conversation, she caught herself waiting for the old version to show up. The one who used to talk over everyone, who needed to win every argument. He never did. Only later, driving home, did she realize she'd spent the whole evening responding to a memory instead of the person sitting across from her. Relationships sometimes become trapped in exactly that pattern. Not because love disappeared, but because one person kept growing while the other kept expecting. And expectations, left unquestioned, quietly become limitations. This doesn't make anyone the villain. We've all carried outdated stories about someone. And we've all carried outdated stories about ourselves. The invitation isn't to blame the brain for trying to keep us safe. It's to ask, am I seeing this person as they are today, or as I've always expected them to be? That question can change a marriage, a friendship, a family relationship. It can even change the relationship we have with ourselves. If that question just landed for you, I'd love to know. Drop a heart below before we continue. Because sometimes the oldest story we're protecting isn't about another person at all. It's the story we've been telling ourselves about who we have to be in order to be loved. And perhaps that's why so many of us find it so hard to stop explaining ourselves. Not because we need everyone's approval, but because somewhere inside, we're still hoping that if we explain clearly enough, we'll finally feel safe enough to belong. It's tempting to believe the answer is simple. If people refuse to see the new version of me, I'll just stop explaining. Sometimes that's even necessary. But I don't think that's where most of our struggle really begins. Because very few of us explain ourselves simply because we enjoy talking. We explain ourselves because somewhere inside us, being understood became connected to feeling safe. Think about a child who falls and immediately looks toward a parent. Before deciding whether to cry, they search one face, not for solutions, but for recognition. Long before we learn language, we learn something deeper. To be seen is to feel safe. That's part of why misunderstanding hurts so much. Not because someone disagrees with us, but because for a brief moment, something old inside us whispers, maybe I'm alone. A man once told me he spent almost a year trying to convince his brother that a rumor about him wasn't true. Every conversation ended the same way. A little more evidence offered, a little less peace left afterward. One day he simply stopped. Not because he stopped caring what his brother thought, but because he finally understood his brother wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for permission to keep believing what he already needed to believe. That's the difference between two very different kinds of conversations. Some are searching for understanding, others are searching for certainty, where the outcome has already been chosen and only the evidence is still being collected. Learning to tell them apart changes everything. It lets us stop measuring the value of our truth by someone else's willingness to receive it. Understanding is an invitation. It cannot be forced. The moment we begin chasing it, it quietly moves farther away. The moment we stop demanding it, we become available for something deeper, self-trust. That doesn't mean becoming closed or defensive. Healthy relationships still deserve honesty, repair, and listening. But there's wisdom in recognizing when we've crossed the line between sharing our truth and begging someone else to validate it. Those two things can look almost identical from the outside. Emotionally, they come from completely different places. One grows from love, the other grows from fear. Perhaps emotional maturity isn't learning to explain ourselves more clearly. Perhaps it's learning to notice the feeling that appears before we begin explaining. Is it love, or is it fear? Is it connection, or the old belief that if we aren't fully understood, we somehow become less worthy? The answer unfolds slowly, conversation after conversation, until one day we notice something remarkable. We still care what people think, but we no longer need every heart to agree before we can remain at peace with our own. Life doesn't introduce us through single moments. It introduces us through repetition. I once spoke with someone who had spent years slowly rebuilding trust with an estranged parent, not through one big apology, but through years of small, unremarkable Sunday phone calls. No dramatic reconciliation scene, just consistency, week after week, until one day the relationship simply felt different. Neither of them could point to the moment it changed. There wasn't one. Think about someone you deeply trust. Chances are you didn't begin trusting them because of one perfect conversation. Trust was built quietly. They showed up when they said they would, admitted mistakes without becoming defensive, stayed kind even when life became difficult. Little by little, you stopped asking, "Can I trust this person?" because you'd already experienced the answer enough times. Character works the same way. It's rarely announced, it's accumulated. It's accumulated. Our culture loves dramatic turning points. Big apologies, powerful speeches, one extraordinary act of courage. Those moments matter, but they rarely change how people experience us over the long run. Habits do. The small choices we repeat eventually become the person other people come to know, and, more importantly, the person we come to know ourselves as. Every small choice is like a quiet vote, not for who we want to become, but for who we're actually becoming. Not perfection, direction. Imagine planting a tree. You don't stand beside it every morning looking for dramatic growth. Most days, nothing appears to happen. Yet beneath the surface, roots continue spreading in ways the eye cannot measure. Growth has never depended on visible progress. It depends on faithful repetition. People may not notice your changes immediately. Some may keep responding to an older version of you for months, even years. That can be discouraging, especially after you've worked hard to grow. But other people don't experience our intentions. They experience our patterns. Eventually, kindness repeated becomes trust. Calm repeated becomes stability. Integrity repeated becomes credibility. Not because we convinced anyone, because consistency speaks a language explanations never can. Sooner or later, the lives we practice become the lives other people experience. But by then, something surprising has already happened. We're no longer living differently so people will finally understand us. We're living differently because this is simply who we've become. As we come to the end of this conversation, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Not an answer, just a question that has quietly changed the way I see difficult relationships. What if the most important thing happening in your life right now isn't what other people think about you, but who you're becoming because of what they've done? Most of us naturally focus on the event, the misunderstanding, the rejection, the silence. We ask, why did this happen? And when will this finally be resolved? Honest questions, but they all keep our attention fixed on the past. Healing asks a different question. Who am I becoming as I walk through this? Think about the people whose presence brings you the deepest sense of peace. Rarely are they people who have lived easy lives. More often, they're people who have suffered without allowing suffering to become their identity. And yet, sitting beside them, you don't feel bitterness. You feel spaciousness, room to breathe, room to be human. I don't think that happens because life was gentle with them. I think it happens because somewhere along the way, they stopped asking every painful experience, "How do I get past this?" and started asking, what is this quietly teaching me about the person I want to become? That question turns pain from an ending into a teacher. There is a quiet freedom that comes when we realize we don't have to win every misunderstanding to live an honest life. We don't have to be fully understood in order to be fully ourselves. That doesn't mean the longing disappears. We're human. We all hope to be seen, known, loved. Those hopes are beautiful. The difference is they no longer become the foundation of our identity. They become gifts we receive when they arrive, rather than conditions we must meet before allowing ourselves to live peacefully. Every difficult relationship is asking us a question, not, can you change the other person, but who will you become because of this? That may be the only question we ever truly have the power to answer. And perhaps that's enough. So if you take only one thought with you today, I hope it's this. Protecting your peace is never the final destination. It is simply the environment where your character continues to grow. And in the end, people may remember what you accomplished, they may remember what you said, but long after those stories have faded, the person you became will still be quietly shaping every life you touch. Thank you for slowing down with me today. If this gave you something to sit with, I'd love it if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take gentle care of yourself.